He's one of the most inventive and successful filmmakers of his generation. A technical wizard who showed us a DeLorean could break the time barrier, that one man could run through modern American history, and that cartoons could live and breathe right alongside us. Robert Zemeckis has directed some of the most iconic films ever made and worked with the biggest stars on the planet. For decades, he's been a titan of Hollywood, a director whose vision has shaped popular culture as we know it. But what happens when that vision slams head-on into the very people supposed to bring it to life? At 73, Robert Zemeckis has supposedly had enough. A bombshell rumor, whispered through the back channels of Hollywood blogs, claims the legendary director has finally named them, the 6 actors he hated working with the most. A secret hit list, built over a career spanning nearly 50 years, holding the names of stars who drove him to the edge. It's a story that would send shockwaves through the industry. And it's almost certainly fake. There's no real proof, no credible source, and no on-the-record confirmation that Robert Zemeckis has ever made a list like that. By all accounts, it's a fabrication, a piece of clickbait designed to get your attention. But the real stories, the documented arguments, the agonizing casting changes that cost millions, the on-set clashes of ego and art, and the landmark legal fights that changed Hollywood forever. Those are even better than a fake list. To really get the genius of Robert Zemeckis, you can't just look at his successes. You have to look at his battles. These aren't just petty feuds. They're stories of how masterpieces get forged in fire. So forget the mythical list. We're going to uncover the truth behind the real clashes that defined his career. So before we get into the messy productions and broken relationships, it's worth asking why a rumor like this even catches fire. We're obsessed with the idea of the tell-all. We crave the uncensored truth, the behind-the-scenes drama that shatters the polished image of Hollywood. A title like Zemeckis names 6 actors he hated is perfectly engineered for that craving. It promises a simple story, a powerful director finally settling old scores, but the reality of making movies, especially at the level Zemeckis works, is way more complicated. The pressure is insane. The budgets are massive. The creative stakes are off the charts. In that kind of high-pressure cooker, friction isn't just a possibility. It's practically a guarantee. Conflicts don't always pop up from personal hate, but from artistic disagreements, money disputes, and the simple, brutal difficulty of getting a movie made. Robert Zemeckis has talked about the sacrifices it takes to make it in Hollywood. He admitted he gave up his entire 20s to his career, calling it a decade of nothing but work, nothing but absolute, driving work. He was a guy with no money and no life, pushed by an ambition his own family thought was a lost cause. That's the picture of a filmmaker obsessed with focus, not petty fights. So his professional disputes are rarely about hate, they're about control. Control over an actor's performance, control over the technology, and ultimately, control over the final vision he sees in his mind. When an actor, for whatever reason, doesn't lock into that vision, Zemeckis has shown he's willing to make a change, no matter how ruthless it seems. So while the hit list is a work of fiction, the conflicts are very, very real. They're the battle. Scars from a career spent on the cutting edge. To understand Zemeckis, we don't need a fake list. We just need to look at the evidence from the battlegrounds where his most famous films were born. And there's no better place to start than with the actor who was almost Marty McFly. It's maybe the most famous recasting in movie history. A decision so late in the game it blew up the budget by $4 million and forced the crew to reshoot almost half the movie. It's the story of how Eric Stoltz was fired from Back to the Future and replaced by Michael J. Fox, and it's the perfect example of a Zemeckis conflict. It wasn't personal. It was all about the performance. In late 1984, Zemeckis and his partner, Bob Gale, were finally getting their dream project made. After tons of rejections, their time travel comedy got the green light from Universal, thanks to executive producer Steven Spielberg. Their top pick for the hero, Marty McFly, was Michael J. Fox, the star of the sitcom Family Ties. But Fox's TV schedule made him a no-go. The network flat out refused to let him do it. Forced to find someone else, they went with Eric Stoltz. Stoltz was a respected young actor known for his intense, serious work in films like Mask. He was a method actor, a true artist, on paper a great choice. In reality, a total disaster. From day one, there was a major disconnect. Zemeckis and Gale wrote Back to the Future as a light, energetic comedy. Stoltz was playing it like a Greek tragedy. He reportedly saw the story as deeply sad, focusing on how Marty comes back to a life where his family memories have been erased. It's an interesting take, but completely wrong for the movie's tone. His method acting also caused problems on set. He insisted on being called Marty all the time. Thomas F. Wilson, who played Biff Tannen, remembered a tense scene where Stoltz got way too aggressive while shoving him. Wilson complained, but Stoltz's defense was that he was just staying in character. The on-set vibe was getting tense. For 5 long weeks, Zemeckis tried to make it work. But watching the daily footage, he got a sinking feeling. The jokes weren't funny. The wide-eyed, frantic energy Marty McFly needed just wasn't there. Zemeckis later admitted, "I just was not getting the laughs that I was hoping for." He knew he'd made a huge mistake, saying, "It was completely my fault. I miscast Eric Stoltz. He's a magnificent actor, but his comedy sensibilities were very different than what I had written with Bob." On January 10, 1985, Zemeckis did the unthinkable. He called Stoltz into his office and fired him. He called it the hardest meeting I've ever had in my life, feeling like he broke the young actor's heart. It was a brutal move, but a necessary one. Spielberg backed him, apparently telling Zemeckis to replace Stoltz or the whole movie might get shut down. Meanwhile, the studio managed to work out a new, crazy deal for Michael J. Fox. He'd shoot Family Ties all day and Back to the Future. All night. The schedule was punishing, but it saved the film. He said yes without even reading the script. When the crew heard they'd be reshooting 5 weeks of work, the reaction was apparently relief. They knew it wasn't working. The change was instant and electric. Fox's natural comedic timing and hyperactive energy were exactly what was missing. He wasn't just playing Marty McFly, he was Marty McFly. The film was saved. Stoltz's performance wasn't bad, it was just wrong. He was a great actor in the wrong part. This wasn't about hate. It was about a creative mismatch, and Zemeckis made a cold, calculated decision to protect his vision, no matter what it cost. If the Eric Stoltz story was a clash of art, the Crispin Glover saga is a much messier story, a collision of art, money, ego, and eventually, the law. It's a fight. That didn't just define a sequel. It set a legal precedent that still protects actors today. In the original Back to the Future, Crispin Glover's performance as George McFly is legendary. It's a masterclass in weirdness. Glover brought a twitchy, strange, and totally captivating energy to the character that made him unforgettable, but even then, there were signs of trouble. Bob Gale called Glover's acting choices nuts, and Zemeckis reportedly had to tell him to dial back some of his weirder ideas for the older George McFly. Glover was an artist with a very strong and sometimes difficult point of view. When it came time for Back to the Future Part 2, those tensions blew up. The two sides tell very different stories. According to producer Bob Gale, Glover wanted too much money. The official offer to Glover was reportedly $125,000, way less than what his co-stars were getting. Glover's side says that was a lowball offer, an insult given how much he brought to the first film. He also had big problems with the script. He thought the sequel story for George, which was all about him being rich, sent a bad message that money equals happiness. He wanted to do more with the character, but the producers weren't having it. Whether it was money, creative differences, or both, the talks failed. Glover was out. What Zemeckis and the producers did next was wild and legally questionable. Instead of just recasting the part, they decided to create a counterfeit Crispin Glover. They hired actor Jeffrey Weissman and, using facial molds made of Glover from the first movie, slapped on prosthetic cheeks, a fake chin, and a new nose to make him look just like Glover. To hide it even more, they filmed Weissman from behind, out of focus, or even hanging upside down. Then they mixed in old, unused shots of the real Crispin Glover from the first film. The goal was obvious: trick the audience into thinking Crispin Glover was in the movie. When Glover saw it, he was furious. It wasn't just that someone else was playing his part. It was that the studio was using his face, his likeness, without his permission and without paying him for it. In 1990, he sued Universal for violating his right of publicity. The studio argued they owned the character of George McFly, but that didn't fly. They hadn't just recreated a character. They had copied an actor's unique face. The case was eventually settled out of court, with reports suggesting Glover received a payment of around $760,000. More importantly, the lawsuit changed the rules in Hollywood. The Screen Actors Guild put new language in its contract. Not all of Robert Zemeckis' conflicts were with people. Sometimes the conflict was with reality itself. The making of Who Framed Roger Rabbit is one of the greatest technical feats in movie history, a perfect blend of live-action detective, story, and cartoon chaos. At the heart of it was British actor Bob Hoskins, who gave an incredible performance as the grumpy, tune-hating detective Eddie Valiant. But the process of making the film nearly broke his mind. Hoskins called it the hardest job he ever had. For months, he worked 16-hour days acting opposite. Well, nothing. While he had some rubber models to practice with when the cameras were rolling, Hoskins was performing to empty air where his cartoon co-stars would be drawn in later. To make it look real, Hoskins couldn't just pretend Roger Rabbit was there. He had to actually see him. He literally trained himself to hallucinate. He even studied his young daughter playing with her imaginary friends to figure out how to do it. This intense method is what made his performance so grounded. When Eddie Valiant grabs Roger by the ears, you feel it because Hoskins felt it. But the technique took a serious mental toll. After 8 months of filming, the line between what was real and what wasn't started to get blurry. Hoskins later admitted that, even after they wrapped, the tunes came home with him. He'd be having a conversation and suddenly see a cartoon weasel peeking out from behind a coat rack. He said, "I think I went a bit mad doing that, lost my mind. The trouble was, I learned how to hallucinate. If you do that for 8 months, it becomes hard to get rid of." The experience left him so mentally exhausted that his doctors told him to take a break. He ended up taking a full year off from acting just to recover. This story shows a different kind of Zemeckis conflict. There was no bad blood between the director and the star. In fact, their work together created one of the most beloved films of the 80s. The conflict here was a side effect of Zemeckis' insane ambition. He was pushing the limits of what was possible with technology, and Hoskins was the soldier on the front lines, taking the psychological hit for that innovation. The pressure on a Zemeckis set isn't always about people fighting. It's about the incredible strain of pulling off a vision that's often right on the bleeding edge of what movies can even do. The story of Bob Hoskins is the story of the human cost of that innovation, a conflict not of egos, but of the mind itself against the impossible demands of a director's imagination. On the surface, the partnership between Robert Zemeckis and Tom Hanks looks like one of the most successful in Hollywood history. Forrest Gump, Castaway, A Polar Express, Pinocchio, and Here. 5 movies, billions of dollars, and a Best Director and Best Actor Oscar for Forrest Gump. That doesn't exactly sound like a recipe for conflict, and yet behind the massive success of their most famous film, Forrest Gump, lies a bitter fight, one that wasn't between the director and his star, but between the filmmakers and the guy who wrote the original story. Winston Groom wrote the novel Forrest Gump. In 1986, his book was darker, weirder, and much more cynical than the movie we all know. In the book, Forrest is a savant who can be rude and unlikable. He's a pro wrestler, an astronaut who goes to space with an ape, and at the end he pretty much abandons his son. Groom pictured someone like John Goodman playing him, when Zemeckis and screenwriter Eric Roth adapted the book. They sanded off all those rough edges. They turned Forrest into a gentle, optimistic soul, a figure of pure innocence in a jaded world. They cut the wilder parts of his life and gave the story a deeply sentimental heart. Basically, they created the Forrest Gump that became a phenomenon, Winston. Groom, however, wasn't thrilled. While he publicly praised Tom Hanks's performance, he also made it clear the movie had sanitized his creation. The film he saw wasn't the dark comedy he wrote. That creative tension was made way worse by a fight over money. Groom was paid $350,000 for the rights to his book and was promised 3% of the film's net profits. Forrest Gump made over $678 million worldwide. It was a monster hit, but when Groom went to collect his share, Paramount Pictures told him there were no profits. Thanks to the magic of Hollywood accounting, where studios inflate costs on paper to make a hit film look like it lost money, the studio claimed the blockbuster was actually in the red. At the same time, Tom Hanks and Robert Zemeckis, who had smartly negotiated for a percentage of the film's gross earnings, each reportedly walked away with around $40 million. To make it worse, during the film's 6 Oscar wins, Winston Groom's name was never mentioned once. The fight was eventually settled when Groom got a 7-figure deal for the rights to his sequel novel, Gump and Co., a book that cheekily opens with Forrest Gump saying, "Don't never let nobody make a movie of your life story." That sequel never got made. This story shows us another side of Zemeckis' world. The conflict wasn't on set. It was in the adaptation process and the boardroom. It shows the power a director like Zemeckis has to reshape a story to fit his own vision, even if it means alienating the original creator. Even on his most beloved film, the road to success was paved with drama. In the 2000s, Robert Zemeckis, a director who always loved special effects, went all in on his most ambitious and divisive project yet. He became the biggest cheerleader for performance capture animation, a technology he thought would change movies forever. This led to 3 animated films, The Polar Express, Beowulf, and A Christmas Carol. With these films, the main conflict in Zemeckis' work changed. It was no longer a fight with a specific actor or writer. It was a fight with the very idea of human performance. Critics and audiences started to ask, had Robert Zemeckis fallen in love with technology at the expense of his characters? The uncanny valley is that creepy feeling you get looking at a robot or animation that's almost human, but not quite. It's the perfect way to describe his motion capture movies. The characters in The Polar Express, for example, have a glassy-eyed, doll-like look that many people found deeply unsettling. The tech, while amazing, seemed to suck the life out of the actors' performances instead of boosting them. Tom Hanks, his most trusted partner, went along for the ride, playing multiple roles in The Polar Express. Jim Carrey did the same in A Christmas Carol. But no matter how expressive the actors were in their motion capture suits, the final result on screen often felt cold. The technology was like a filter, putting a wall between the actor's soul and the audience. The complaints weren't just about looks. They were about the story. Beowulf felt more like a video game cutscene than an epic poem. A Christmas Carol, with all its spectacle, lacked the warmth of other versions. It seemed like Zemeckis was more interested in what the technology could do, the wild camera moves, the de-aging, than in the human stories he was telling. This tech obsession continued, even when he went back to live-action films. Welcome to Marwen was a box office disaster that awkwardly mixed real actors with motion-captured dolls. His 2024 film Here once again leaned heavily on de-aging technology to let Tom Hanks and Robin Wright play their characters across decades. The film drew mixed to negative reviews, with many critics finding the AI-driven de-aging to be distracting and unnatural. This later part of his career suggests a filmmaker who may have become a victim of his own genius. The conflicts here are almost philosophical. By choosing pixels over people, Zemeckis created a new kind of friction, not with an actor's ego, but with the audience's ability to connect at all. It makes you wonder, did the ultimate innovator finally innovate himself into a creative dead end, where the tools became more important than the art? So let's go back to where we started. The fake hit list of 6 hated actors. We know it's a myth, but through the real stories of conflict with actors, writers, technology, and reality itself, a clear picture of Robert Zemeckis, the filmmaker, starts to form. He's not a director who hates actors. He's a director who is pathologically Obsessively and brilliantly devoted to his vision, the common thread in all these fights is Zemeckis' relentless, almost tyrannical need to get a specific result. He's a master technician, a cinematic engineer. For him, a film set isn't a democracy. It's a lab where every single variable has to be controlled. When Eric Stoltz's serious, dramatic style failed to create the comedy Zemeckis engineered for Back to the Future, Stoltz became a faulty part. He had to be swapped out for one that worked. Michael J. Fox, it wasn't malice. It was mechanics. When Crispin Glover's demands threatened to mess up the sequel, he became an obstacle. Zemeckis' solution, while legally and ethically wrong, was brutally practical from a technical view. If you can't get the actor, just build a copy. When faced with getting a human to act opposite a cartoon, his expectation wasn't that the actor just pretend. It was that the actor, Bob Hoskins, literally bend his own mind to make the illusion real, no matter the mental cost. And when live actors could no longer create the visual fantasy he was dreaming of, he ditched them for motion capture, treating stars like Tom Hanks and Jim Carrey as data points for a machine he could control perfectly. This is the Zemeckis method. It's a furious drive for perfection, where perfection means flawlessly executing a preconceived vision. His conflicts erupt when the messy, unpredictable human element, an actor's idea, a writer's pride, or a performer's physical limits gets in the way of that vision. He's not a monster. By many accounts, he's a great collaborator. But his final loyalty isn't to the people on his set. It's to the film inside his head. The conflicts that have defined his career weren't born from hate. They're the explosive side effects of a genius who will stop at nothing to make the impossible real, and to get the images in his imagination onto the screen, perfectly and without compromise. We started this journey with a juicy rumor, a secret list of actors Robert Zemeckis hated. What we found was something far more interesting. The list isn't real, because the story of Robert Zemeckis isn't about petty fights. It's a story about the massive friction between a powerful artistic vision and the messy reality of making movies. The stories of Eric Stoltz, Crispin Glover, and Bob Hoskins aren't just gossip. They are landmark moments in Hollywood history. They are warnings about the price of innovation, the fight for creative control, and the pressure cooker that creates timeless films. Zemeckis is a filmmaker who has always chosen the vision over everything else. His greatest hits, like Back to the Future and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, can't be separated from the fights that made them. They prove that sometimes the hardest productions make the most unforgettable art. His career is proof of one powerful idea: to do something truly new, you have to be willing to be difficult, demanding, and sometimes ruthless. The only question is, where do you draw the line? Asterisk, asterisk, what do you think? Is Robert Zemeckis a demanding genius whose methods are justified by the masterpieces he's created? Or has his focus on technology sometimes come at the cost of the human heart of his stories? Let us know in the comments below. Asterisk, asterisk.